afternoon, everyone. Christina asked me to distill a 90-minute presentation into 10 minutes. And I come from an academic background where a 90-minute presentation can easily be turned into an 180-minute presentation. But I'll take pity on you. So I'm just going to make a couple of key points. The first is there's a lot of confusion about what is race, what is ethnicity, is Hispanic a race, that sort of thing. So race is a construct of the modern Western world, actually. The concept of race is only about 500 years old. And the idea of race is that there's some biological basis for how human beings are different. If you actually look at it from a scientific perspective, that's actually not, it doesn't work. There's really no such thing as race. I mean, if you really want to divide human beings, definitely gender is really important. We kind of have parallel evolution tracks. So we're almost subspecies of each other. You could think of genders as subspecies. I'm sure that's related to emotional intelligence. But in terms of race, what happens is that what we attribute, I mean, obviously race is related to genes, and so you can obviously see differences in people. But the amount of genes that account for how we look is an extremely small proportion of the total amount of genes that distinguish us. So, and they're not particularly important genes. For example, for me, I have a gene that gives me a defective heart valve. That's a lot more important, for example, than my hair color. It seems to be hereditary. There's 4 people in my family, just between me, my siblings, nieces and nephews, and father, in that short time span, a lot of people. So that's very important. So anyway, and then race is also tied to this idea of the great chain of being. You know, you have Noah's Ark, and you have the giraffes, and then you have the mice, and everybody has their place in nature. And so it's very easy to then create a parallel. You have this race, and they all have their place in nature as ordained by God. Some on top, some at the bottom, some ruling, some being ruled. That's kind of the origin of that. And in this country, we tend to think of race as real and kind of as absolute. We tend to take for granted our categories of race. We don't realize that in other countries, the categories of race are completely different. In Brazil, they're completely different. In South Africa, under apartheid, you had very different categories. And then, of course, race in this country is really about black and white. And so when you start throwing in Asians and Hispanics into the mix, it gets kind of confusing. So anyway, that's what race is.
What we have here, what emotional intelligence is really at its heart, is really how we are able to identify our own emotions, how we're able to assess them, how we're able to control them, but not just our own, but those of others and then those of the group. And I think the one we struggle with the most, we struggle enough with our own, so then the thought of assessing and controlling the emotions of others and of groups become even more difficult when we struggle with ourselves. So this is all about your emotional radar. And I say, I prefer influence instead of control, because control can sound manipulative, but what we're really talking about is making sure that we are able to harness this emotional knowledge. Emotions they're knowledge. And so harness that knowledge and be able to leverage that to influence relationships and influence outcomes. Now that obviously can get very difficult, and you'll see I like lightening up some presentations, especially some topics that can be somewhat heavy with some light pictures. So, but what we have here is, for a long time we've created what some would call this kind of either or mentality in leadership and in decision making, where it's either very rational or it's very emotional. And I think especially as women, and I'm going to bring in some of the stereotype here, women are often labeled as highly emotional. And African American women and Latino women especially are labeled as overly emotional. And therefore, I think there are times where we try to turn that off. So we move way over to the rational side, right? And try and shut off that emotion so we don't appear overly aggressive or overly friendly or overly, fill in the blank. And what we are going to have to do here, when I talk about the emotional intelligence, what we're really trying to do here is find that balance where we're actually leveraging both and understanding how people perceive us, understanding how people may perceive the situation and perceive our emotions, and then what do we do to then try and minimize or immobilize some of that negative impact of their perceptions. So when I've studied this and why I speak on it so much, just so we are all on the same page here, is that I've come to realize that whenever we are master this, whenever we focus on it, you end up with more persuasive communications. You end up with stronger relationships. You end up with better performing teams. You're going to end up with, as you can see up here, but you're better able to resolve conflict. The biggest part of any conflict when you get into a group is the emotional aspect of it. And if you can learn how to harness that and understand and perceive that and manage that, the conflict resolution becomes a lot easier.
Motivated by the offender's bias against race, religion, disability, veteran status, ethnic or national origin, or sexual and gender identity groups. Now, microaggressions are brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to certain individuals because of their group membership. These are unconsciously delivered, and they're delivered as dismissive looks, gestures, tones sometimes, the tone that they talk to you. They tend to be so pervasive, and automatic in daily conversations that we just don't notice them. We often dismiss them. Both types of, both types of discrimination are very hard to identify, to quantify, or to rectify, right? Because they're very nebulous and because they remain relatively invisible. But they can be very harmful to the individual, and especially at work, in the workplace. So there are three types. There are three types of racial transgressions. One is conscious, they are conscious and unconscious. One is microassaults, which are conscious and intentional actions. And these are name-calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory actions. The other ones that are unconscious are micro-insults and micro-invalidations. These are often unconscious, and they can be verbal and non-verbal communications, and they convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage. For example, when you assign a degree of intelligence to a person that according to their race, like let's say that somebody comes to me, a Latina, right, with an accent and all that stuff, and they're like, oh, so I wonder how she got this job. Just underlaying that I got the job because of maybe affirmative action. So these are kind of the type of micro insults. And they're really daily conversations, right? I mean, you don't notice that. Maybe you don't notice that you're saying it, but the person that is receiving it is feeling a little bit not uneasy, I guess. And the other one is micro-invalidations. These are communications that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feeling, or experiential reality of a person. So, for example, again, let's go to the Latinos, right? So we are, let's say, my friend from Texas, right? and she is asked like, so where are you from? And she's like, from Texas. Not really, where are you from? From Texas. Not really, where are you from? So you are creating the, this message that they're perpetual foreigners in their own land. So these are the type of micro-invalidations. So because of the less obvious nature, these micro-insults and micro-invalidations create this feeling of, make this person feel insulted, but this person may not know why. I mean, you're in a conversation, you're like, I mean, I have something here that happened, and I don't feel good, and I have like this gut feeling that something wasn't right in that conversation, right? But also the person who made that comment might not realize that they did offended that person. So it's a catch-22, right? Because if the person who felt insulted said something, the other person is going to be like, no, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. So it's really, and especially in the workplace, it can create a lot of conflict.